Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Ohio history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. Known locally as the Blackwood Farm, it stood in deteriorating condition in the fall of 1901 amidst the undulating farmlands of Licking County, Ohio. Nearly a mile from its closest neighbor, the old two-story farmhouse was situated at the end of a lengthy dirt lane. According to county records, Edward and Margaret Blackwood, who had migrated from Pennsylvania with their newborn twin sons, Samuel and Silas, had bought the land in 1885. Up until the 17th of October 1901, when local postman Frederick Dunn observed that mail had piled up at the Blackwoods' mailbox for almost 3 weeks, the population of Newark was mostly unaware of what transpired inside those walls during the next 16 years. The Blackwood property was surrounded by mostly agricultural terrain, with a few family farms that had been in operation for many generations. The region's commercial center was the nearby town of Newark, which had a population of little over 18,000 inches, the 1900 census. The Blackwood Farm was situated in Street, Albins's Township, which was distinguished by its rich forest, gently sloping hills, and rich soil that was suitable for growing corn, wheat, and other vegetable crops. The Blackwood property itself was situated in a small valley, partially obscured from the main road by a long-neglected copse of oak and maple trees. Dunn brought his concerns to the attention of Sheriff James Holcomb, who sent Deputy William Hayes to conduct a welfare check at the property, according to the Newark Advocate's the 19th of October, 1901. Archived issue. According to the newspaper report, Hayes was selected for his professionalism and discretion, citing his 15 years of experience as a veteran officer in the county sheriff's department. Although most of what Hayes found was purposefully kept out of the public record at the time, it would turn out to be one of the most unsettling cases in Ohio's history. Hayes quickly requested more officers and the county coroner after reading the official report, which was sealed until 1952, about the circumstances within the farmhouse. Since coming to the county, the Blackwood family had apparently lived in near total seclusion. Margaret was seldom seen, though Edward Blackwood was known to come into town once a month for supplies, sometimes accompanied by the twins. The Newark Historical Society's town archives include ledgers from Jensen's General Shop that document Edward Blackwood's monthly purchases, usually on the first Monday of the month. Unusual amounts of salt, alcohol, and other chemicals that would subsequently be recognized as ingredients in crude embalming techniques were regularly included in these transactions. The twins' uncanny resemblance in appearance and demeanor, as well as their limited speech, were observed by their neighbors. The sealed report contained a statement given to Deputy Hayes by Mrs. Eleanor Winters, whose farm was adjacent to the Blackwood property to the north. She talked about meeting the twins in the summer of 1899 as follows. "I came upon them at the edge of our property, standing completely still and watching our farm hands at work. When I approached and asked if they needed anything, they turned to look at me simultaneously. Their movements so perfectly matched, it seemed rehearsed. I mentioned it to my husband that evening, and he forbade me from speaking to them again." In his personal journal, which was found during a 1963 church restoration, the Reverend Thomas Whitaker of Newark's First Presbyterian Church wrote that the Blackwood twins had only attended Sunday services 3 times in 16 years. Each time, they remained still the entire time, their gazes unblinking, neither interested nor uneasy. Whitaker also wrote that he had tried to talk to Edward Blackwood about the family's religious education, but had been graciously told that they were a private family. Neither spoke, but one I could not tell which slowly shook his head. They then turned and walked away in perfect unison, like they were joined by invisible string. Whitaker wrote in her July 1897 diary that she was worried about household. There is something deeply troubling about the Blackwood situation. The father appears educated and well-spoken, yet chooses such isolation. The mother was once seen in town with bruising around her wrists, though she attributed this to a fall. The boys, now 12, show none of the natural exuberance of youth. "I fear what grows in shadow rarely thrives in wholesome ways." According to the 1900 census, Edward Blackwood identified himself as an agricultural engineer, but local traders said he mostly bought books and specialist equipment instead of ordinary farming implements. In a testimony to investigators, Harold Jenkins, the owner of Newark's sole bookstore at the time, mentioned that Blackwood frequently purchased scientific publications, medical manuals, and anatomical studies from publishers in New York and Philadelphia. Jenkins remembered Blackwood's explanation that he was conducting independent research of a sensitive nature that required specialized knowledge. There was not much indication of productive farming on the property itself. A small vegetable garden and a few livestock animals were mentioned in the property assessment, but Hayes's first report suggested that what they did grow was mostly for their own consumption. According to school attendance records, the twins never attended a local school. A letter from the local school board to Edward Blackwood in 1892, which was discovered in the county historical archives, asked about the education of the boys, who were 7 years old at the time. Blackwood replied that they were receiving specialized home instruction, appropriate to their unique intellectual needs. No other questions were recorded. Although Ohio's 1877 compulsory education law mandated that children aged 8 to 14 attend school for at least 12 weeks annually, it was not always enforced in rural regions. And homeschooling was allowed as long as parents could show that proper instruction was being provided. Even after examination, the Blackwoods' pre-op history in Ohio remained somewhat a mystery. According to records, Edward Blackwood attended the University of Pennsylvania for 2 years to study medicine before leaving in 1879 without earning his degree. In 1883, he sought for a marriage license in Philadelphia to Margaret Winters, who had no connection to the nearby Winters family. According to birth certificates, the twins were born in Pennsylvania Hospital on the 12th of January, 1885. A string of stories in the Philadelphia Inquirer about strange fatalities at a medical research center where Edward had worked as a laboratory assistant seemed to correspond with the family's departure from Philadelphia. Although there was never a definite link found between these incidents and the Blackwoods' move, investigators were concerned about the timing. On that October afternoon, Deputy Hayes went up to the Blackwood farmhouse and noticed right away that it seemed deserted. According to his official report, the walkway leading to the porch was surrounded by weeds that were almost 3 feet high in the front yard. On the ground story, shutters hung crookedly from their hinges, and several windows were damaged. The front door was half open and swung softly in the fall wind. As he got closer to the entrance, Hayes said he noticed a strong smell, which he initially thought was caused by dead animals or untended garbage. Hayes entered the main foyer and saw a house in a state of disrepair, with dust on most surfaces and what looked like months' worth of piled mail and newspapers on the floor. Hayes yelled out again and again but got no answer. After searching the bottom level, he discovered the kitchen in a state of chaos, with rotting food still on the dining table's dishes. It looked as though a dinner had been left unfinished. On the frigid stove, a pot of what had been stew was still there, a congealed mass of indefinable substance. According to Hayes' report, the kitchen had evidence of being scrupulously ordered in the past, with jars and containers labeled and arranged alphabetically on shelves, indicating a tendency for methodical organization. This showed an abrupt disruption to established patterns and contrasted strikingly with the current state of chaos. Numerous bookshelves in the living room had medical materials, anatomical illustrations, and a number of journals written in what would subsequently be recognized as Edward Blackwood's handwriting. According to Hayes, a lot of the volumes had cross-references and lengthy margin notes, which suggested in-depth research. Several obscure European medical publications examining conjoined twin cases and the so-called sympathetic connection between identical siblings were among the texts on twin research that were of great interest. Numerous books on mortuary science and preservation methods held prominent places on the shelf, many of which were clearly frequently consulted. The sealed report states that Hayes went upstairs and discovered the master bedroom to be unoccupied but messy. Clothes were scattered all over the parents' bed, as if they had packed in a hurry. A number of bureau drawers were half emptied and left open. Strands of long dark hair that were later recognized as Margaret's were found in a hairbrush on the dresser. On the bedside table, Hayes noticed a framed picture of a much younger Edward and Margaret standing in front of what seemed like a university building, grinning. In his personal notes, which his widow later gave to the County Historical Society, Hayes noted that something had clearly broken in this family, turning what began as promise into something unrecognizable. This was a stark contrast to the way their lives were going at the time. There were 2 immaculately made beds in a smaller bedroom that looked as if it had never been used. The fact that this room had no personal belongings at all, no clothes, books, or toys that one might typically find in a room belonging to a teenage boy, made Hayes feel more uneasy. Except for a big anatomical chart depicting the human nerve system, the walls were blank. Under the window, 2 desks were arranged side by side, each holding identical notebooks with what seemed like scientific observations written in exact matching handwriting. According to Hayes, the handwriting was so similar that it was hard to tell which twin had authored which notebook. The first indication of something very unsettling was found in the 3rd bedroom at the end of the upstairs corridor. This room had been transformed into what Hayes called a makeshift laboratory or study area. Only a few oil lamps were used for illumination, and the windows were covered with thick black cloth. Various tools were neatly arranged along the edge of a large wooden table that dominated the center of the room. According to Hayes, the table had stains and deep grooves that were typical of drainage channels. Below, the floor slanted slightly in the direction of a major drain. According to his official account, Hayes initially thought the preserved organic items in the jars were animal parts. Hand-drawn illustrations of human and animal anatomy, with an emphasis on the brain and nervous system, covered the room's walls. Hayes, who had been a medical orderly for a short time during the Spanish-American War, knew enough of the terminology to know that he was looking at documentation of systematic experimentation on living subjects, and one whole wall was devoted to what looked like a timeline of experiments with dates and notation like Subject A 42 minutes and Subject B 17 minutes post-cessation. Hayes pulled open a locked cabinet in this chamber to reveal a series of picture plates depicting what looked to be animal surgery and, more unsettlingly, what appeared to be human patients. Although the faces in these pictures were hidden, Hayes wrote in his report that the meticulous recording and the clinical accuracy in the pictures indicated this was not the result of spontaneous violence, but rather of deliberate research. It was then that Hayes went back to his car to call the county coroner and other cops. But what was really disclosed about what had happened at Blackwood Farm was in the basement. As Hayes descended the slender wooden stairs, he was confronted by an unfathomable scene. Heavy canvas sheets hung from the ceiling had been used to divide the basement into parts. Hayes found what looked to be a collection of clothing items, personal belongings, and little mementos in the first compartment. Each item was meticulously documented and dated. The most recent date recorded was September 1901, and the earliest was May 1893. Hayes identified objects that fit the descriptions of belongings of people who had been reported missing from nearby counties throughout the preceding 8 years. Hayes discovered what he called proof of intensive preservation work behind the second canvas partition. Surgical tools, a number of technical publications on embalming and preservation methods, and a variety of chemicals in labeled bottles were all on a big work table. On this table was a logbook with thorough entries on individuals identified solely by dates and initials. Hayes pointed out that numerous entries included the notation "observed by S and S," which investigators eventually determined referred to the twins, Samuel and Silas. The notes also contained measurements, observations regarding tissue elasticity and preservation quality, and references to sympathetic response testing. About 2 hours after Hayes was first discovered, County Coroner Dr. Robert Chambers was sent at the site. The remains of 17 people in varying levels of preservation were recognized in the third portion of the basement by his medical examiner's report, which was similarly sealed until 1952. Others were more recent, and some had been dead for what seemed like years. The meticulous placement of these remains was the most unsettling. They had been set up on chairs, seated at a tiny table, or positioned as though they were going about their daily lives in a variety of tableaus scattered throughout the basement. In his assessment, Dr. Chambers pointed out that the preservation methods employed were advanced and demonstrated how the approach had changed over time. While the more recent remains had significant technical proficiency, the earliest preserved remains revealed very rudimentary work. According to Chambers, a number of bodies had undergone extensive modification, which included moving the preserved remains by means of mechanical equipment and rearranging limbs using wire supports. The proof that some remains had been placed in pairs, precisely mirroring each other's posture, was the most upsetting to Chambers. The Newark Advocate merely stated that investigators were looking into the discovery of several remains at the Blackwood property. Sheriff Holcomb purposefully kept the full scope of what was discovered hidden from the public out of concern that the information would spread panic. In a letter written to the mayor of Newark and found in the municipal archives in a file titled Confidential 1901, Holcomb stated, "The scene at the Blackwood farm exceeds in depravity anything I have witnessed in my 27 years of law enforcement. I believe it serves no public good to disclose the full extent of what was discovered. The citizens of this county should be spared the knowledge that such aberrations of human nature existed in their midst. More practically, I fear that full disclosure would incite panic, vigilante action, or perhaps even morbid curiosity that might lead unstable minds toward similar paths." No immediate sign of Edward and Margaret Blackwood. It appeared from their personal items that they had departed the residence a few weeks prior. Margaret Blackwood's remains were found during a later search of the barn, under the floorboards of a storage room, in what looked to be a hastily dug grave. According to the coroner's assessment, she had been dead for 3 to 4 weeks before being found. In his private examination notes, which were later donated to the Ohio Medical Historical Society, Dr. Chambers noted that Margaret's body had been positioned in a way that suggested an attempt at preservation similar to that seen with the other victims, but apparently abandoned in progress. The cause of death was listed as severe trauma to the cranium from behind with a blunt instrument. As a result, investigators speculated that her passing might have caused the twins to flee and the family to break up. A nationwide warning was issued for Edward Blackwood and the twins, who are now 16 years old, as their locations were still unknown. Local police enforcement departments in Ohio and other states received the family's photos. The twins were reported as having dark hair, pale complexions, and unusually light blue eyes. They looked exactly alike. Both were described as having a skinny frame for their age and an average height. Aboard the 23rd of September 1901, a Columbus telegraph operator saw 2 young men who fit their description getting aboard an eastward train, but he was unable to identify them from the given photos. For several weeks, the Blackwood property was still under investigation. Investigators discovered in-depth notebooks documenting Edward Blackwood's growing worries about his son's behavior among his personal documents. Records from 1893, when the boys would have been 8 years old, detailed cases of local animals discovered disfigured close to the house. As the years went by, Edward's entries grew more and more upset, detailing the lad's strange fascination with death and the unsettling experiments he found them carrying out on tiny creatures. On June 17, 1896, an entry stated, "M insists we should seek help for the boys, but where would we go? Who would understand? The incident with the Miller girl last month has convinced me we cannot risk exposing their condition to outsiders. We must manage this ourselves. I have increased their studies in anatomy and biology, hoping to channel their interests in a more scientific direction. There are no records of any incident involving a Miller girl in the county records from that period. Although the 1895 census does mention a Miller family with a daughter residing about 3 miles from the Blackwood property. According to reports, their family left the area in late 1896. Investigators found the Millers had moved to Indiana and changed their name when they tried to find them in 1902. According to a detective dispatched to speak with them, Mrs. Miller refused to talk about any contacts with the family and was very upset at the mention of the Blackwood name. Although no records of her enrollment could be confirmed, their daughter, who would have been 11 years old in 1896, was supposedly enrolled in a boarding school in another state. A letter that Edward Blackwood reportedly wrote to Dr. James Morton at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia, but never sent, was the most illuminating item discovered among his archives. This letter, sent in August 1901, described Edward's developing anxiety about his son's expanding knowledge of human anatomy and preservation methods. He said that he had restricted them to the property after finding them trying to exhume a recently buried body at the nearby cemetery. The letter went on to say, "They speak now almost exclusively to each other in what appears to be a language of their own creation. I can no longer distinguish Samuel from Silas, as they seem to have deliberately adopted identical mannerisms and speech patterns. M wishes to leave, to abandon the farm and them with it, but I cannot bring myself to give up on them entirely. I fear, however, that we may soon have no choice but to seek institutional intervention." Their fascination with what they call the perfect preservation has progressed beyond academic interest to something I can only describe as obsessive devotion. They speak of creating permanent companions that will never leave or change. I discovered last week that they have been using the basement without my knowledge or permission, and what I found there has convinced me that immediate action is required. Several of the pages from Edward's journal, particularly those from late August to mid-September 1901, had been ripped out. Investigators found a telegram sent by Edward Blackwood to Dr. Morton in Philadelphia on the 21st of September, 1901, which read simply, "Situation untenable. Stop. Require immediate assistance. Stop. Arriving Thursday with subjects. Stop. Prepare secure accommodations." This indicated that Edward had finally made the decision to seek professional help for his sons and was preparing to transport them to the Pennsylvania Hospital for institutional care. The final entry, dated September 20th, read only, "They were watching us sleep again last night, standing perfectly still at the foot of our bed for hours. M wants to leave tomorrow. I've agreed we'll go to her sister's in Columbus and return with help." Although the coroner estimated Margaret's death date to be around September 22nd or 23rd, shortly after this telegram was delivered, it was unclear what circumstances prevented this plan from being carried out. A conductor on the Pennsylvania Railroad reported seeing two identical young guys on their way east from Columbus on the 3rd of November 1901. He remembered them because, despite having only bought one ticket, they were two people traveling together and conversed in low voices the entire time. They bought a second ticket in silence and went back to their hushed chat when he questioned them about the necessity of two. The conductor saw the circulated photos of the Blackwood twins and reported this meeting to the authorities. He saw that the young guys alternated clutching a single leather bag, which they exchanged at exact intervals, perhaps in accordance with an internal clock that was hidden from others. About 5 miles from the family farm, on the 10th of November 1901, Edward Blackwood's body was found next to a creek. While looking for a lost cow, George Wilson, a local farmer, discovered the remains. Wilson told authorities that he discovered the body jammed under a fallen tree trunk, partially submerged in the creek. According to the coroner's findings, Edward had been dead for roughly 6 to 7 weeks, which means his death coincided with his wife's. Although there was evidence of blunt force injuries to the back of his head, which showed he had been unconscious when he entered the water, drowning was the cause of death. During his investigation, Dr. Chambers saw that Edward's body had lividity patterns that were not consistent with the position in which he was discovered, indicating that it had been relocated after death. This implied that he had been killed somewhere else and brought to the creek at a later time. Chambers's most unsettling finding was that Edward's hands had been meticulously placed, fingers intertwined across his chest, much like the fictitious victims discovered in the basement. Although it was mentioned in Chambers's private medical notebook, this information was left out of public papers, indicating that the twins had treated their father like any other object in their collection. For many years, the identity of the 17 victims discovered in the Blackwood basement were being investigated. Although missing people reports from neighboring counties offered potential matches for some of the more recent remains, many were never positively identified. Their disappearances might not have sparked instant alarm because most of them seemed to be tourists, transitory laborers, or people without close local ties. A special inquiry commission headed by Sheriff Holcomb tracked out the Blackwood twins' whereabouts and activities until 1902. They learned that Edward Blackwood had informed local authorities on at least 6 occasions between 1897 and 1901 that different travelers had sought refuge at their farm during bad weather but had since left. Several of the victims' estimated disappearance periods matched these reports, which were ostensibly made to create an official record of temporary visitors to the property. This implied a deliberate attempt to come up with believable justifications for the stranger's presence close to the property in case there were any follow-up inquiries. The Blackwood farmhouse was destroyed in a suspected fire in March 1902. The building itself was gone, but the majority of the evidence gathered from the scene had already been taken to the county sheriff's office. There were local whispers that the house had been purposefully set on fire by worried residents to get rid of what they saw as a blight on their community, but no one was ever convicted with arson. The vacant Blackwood property, site of tragic events last autumn, was consumed by fire late Tuesday night. The sheriff's office has declined to speculate on the cause of the blaze. County officials have indicated the property will be sold at auction to cover outstanding tax obligations. Read the 15th of March 1902 article in the Newark Advocate. Throughout 1902, efforts to locate Samuel and Silas Blackwood were fruitless. A Philadelphia boarding house reported in January 1903 that 2 identical young men had taken rooms there but had hardly left except at night. According to the proprietress, Mrs. Helen Cavendish, the young guys talked to each other very infrequently and paid their rent on time in cash. The men had left, leaving behind a number of medical texts and illustrations of human anatomy by the time officials looked into the matter. According to the owner of the boarding house, they had claimed to be medical students, but she had grown increasingly alarmed by their actions. She explained that they occasionally spoke in unison or completed one another's sentences with little apparent effort, and that they used the pronouns I interchangeably while discussing actions that were obviously carried out by the other. In early 1903, detectives spoke with Dr. James Morton. The Dr. Edward Blackwood had tried to contact. I knew Edward from my time at the University of Pennsylvania, and I knew that he was married and had twin sons, he disclosed. The news shocked Morton, who described Edward as a brilliant mind with particular interest in neurological research. Though perhaps too willing to pursue unconventional avenues of inquiry, Morton acknowledged receiving Edward's telegram in September 1901 and preparing for the family's arrival. But they never showed up. Morton paused before admitting that conjoined twin instances and the neurological relationships between identical siblings had been 2 of Edward's most intriguing research topics. Morton said that he had once given Edward access to medical records that detailed unusual twin occurrences, such as instances in which twins reported having the same thoughts or experiencing the same bodily feelings. Until 1907, when a string of disappearances in western Massachusetts caught the attention of local police, the Blackwood brothers' case remained unsolved. Over the course of 6 months, 5 people disappeared from Pittsfield. Evidence from an investigation indicated that 2 people had recently occupied a secluded cabin in the Berkshire Mountains. One of the items discovered was a journal with entries that remarkably resembled the substance and writing style of the journals discovered at Blackwood Farm. But no bodies were found, and the cabin's inhabitants had left before the police could get there. Several glass plates containing photographic negatives were found by local police. When the photos were developed, they revealed what seemed to be more advanced preservation operations than those carried out at the Blackwood Farm. The photos of complex systems of tubing and mechanical devices connecting 2 bodies together were particularly noteworthy since they seemed to be attempts to make artificial links between preserved human remains. One of the plates has the following notation: Experiment 37. Mechanical synchronization achieved, but still far from true unity. In 1912, Dr. Harold Jenkins, a psychology professor at Boston University, wrote a brief scholarly article titled Folie à deux, a study of shared psychopathology in identical twins. Although the article did not specifically mention the Blackwood case, It did include a thorough examination of a scenario with striking parallels. Dr. Jenkins hypothesized that a shared delusional system that reinforced and magnified deviant behaviors may be created by the close relationship between identical twins, isolation, and potential innate psychiatric abnormalities. According to Jenkins's personal notes, which were found among his belongings after his death in 1935, he had conducted a private interview in 1911 with an unnamed subject he thought to be one of the Blackwood twins. His paper was never widely circulated and was eventually removed from publication at the request of the university board, who considered its content too disturbing for general academic consumption. After being discovered roaming in what appeared to be bewilderment, the person was briefly institutionalized at a private sanitarium in upstate New York, where the meeting purportedly took place. Jenkins stated that although the man seemed much older than his actual age would indicate, he was virtually identical to photos of the Blackwood brothers. Jenkins's finding that the subject varied between using the pronouns I and we, and occasionally appeared unsure of which memories belonged to him, was the most unsettling. Following intervention by an unnamed donor, the subject left the institution and vanished before Jenkins could interview them again. When a doctor in Baltimore reported treating two similar men in their mid-30s for chemical burns in 1919, it was the last verified sighting of people thought to be the Blackwood twins. The guys came to his practice late one evening to receive treatment for burns on their wrists and forearms, according to a note made by Dr. Thomas Elliott in his medical journal. According to the doctor, the men showed an uncommon level of knowledge about human anatomy and preservation methods, talked very little, and mostly used gestures and whispers to communicate with one another. When the doctor asked them about their history, they said they were morticians from Ohio. They never came back for follow-up care, and the address they gave was later discovered to be a fake. Dr. and A. Elliott's notes described a particularly unsettling aspect of his interaction with the men. The patients displayed a most unusual tolerance for pain, showing no reaction to procedures that would typically cause significant discomfort. More disturbing was their apparent fascination with the treatment itself. While I dressed the burns on one patient's hands, I observed the other touching his own unblemished skin in precisely the same locations, as if experiencing the sensation vicariously. When I commented on this behavior, they exchanged a look I can only describe as knowing amusement. A mortician in Richmond, Virginia said in 1924 that two similar men had approached him about working at his funeral parlor. Uncomfortable with their over-interest in preservation methods and their unsettling manner, he dismissed their services and later recognized them from images as potentially the Blackwood twins. The case was no longer the subject of an active inquiry at this point, and no formal follow-up was carried out. When the Blackwood case's sealed documents were eventually made available for historical archiving in 1952, Ohio State University researcher Elizabeth Morgan made an effort to create a thorough account of the case. Morgan's investigation revealed hitherto unnoticed links between the Blackwood case and a number of unresolved disappearances that occurred in the eastern United States between 1901 and 1925. According to her research, the twins might have been accountable for up to 30 more victims in addition to those discovered at the farmhouse. Morgan never finished his research. According to university records, she took an unplanned leave of absence in 1954 and never came back to work. Before being destroyed in a 1968 storage facility fire, her notes and unfinished manuscript were kept in the university's archives. According to her coworkers, Morgan had grown more paranoid in the weeks leading up to her abrupt departure. Saying she was under surveillance by identical men she occasionally glimpsed watching her apartment or following her on campus. University officials attributed these claims to the psychological strain of being engrossed in the unsettling details of the Blackwood case and suggested she take some time off. The last entry in Morgan's personal journal, which was found in her abandoned apartment, was made on the 12th of March 1954. I no longer believe this is imagination. The same face, twice, watching from across the street. They know I found the connection between Baltimore, Richmond, and Boston. The pattern of disappearances forms a clear migratory path. I've arranged to meet with Detective Collins tomorrow to share my findings. After that, I'll accept Professor Wilson's offer of temporary accommodation until this matter is resolved. There was no record of any scheduled meeting between Morgan and Detective Harold Collins of the Columbus Police Department, and Professor Wilson denied offering Morgan temporary housing. Although a bus ticket to Chicago that was bought in Morgan's name was found among her belongings, it was unclear where she went after that, raising the possibility that she may have left the area. The case was formally categorized as unresolved in 1960 after several inquiries into her disappearance failed to provide any solid findings. Edward's private notebooks revealed the most unsettling element of the Blackwood case. He wrote about problematic behaviors that he first ascribed to the special relationship between identical twins in notes from the twins' early childhood. By the time they were 4 years old, the brothers were almost identical in terms of appearance, voice, and mannerisms. They frequently flawlessly mirrored each other's gestures without making eye contact, giving the impression that they could communicate without speaking. They appeared to share physical sensations as well as experiences, Edward observed. The other twin would frequently react as though they were feeling the same pain when the first twin hurt himself. As the twins grew older, Edward explained how they started doing what he called experiments to test the limits of their connection. In one unsettling entry from 1894, he wrote, "Found S and S in the woods behind the barn. S had cut his arm with my razor, and both watched in fascination as identical welts appeared on the other's arm moments later." When questioned, they simply stated they were learning how it works. M wanted to call Dr. Holloway, but I persuaded her that it was just a case of childish curiosity gone too far. According to Edward's journal, the twins' relationship went beyond the usual occurrence of identical twin synchronicity. He recorded cases in which, while being blinded or in different rooms, one twin seemed to feel the sensory input aimed at the other. The journal suggested that Edward, who had some medical training but no formal degree, became increasingly fascinated by his son's condition. In 1895, he wrote, "Conducted test with S1 and S2 today. S1 was blindfolded and seated in the kitchen. S2 was taken to the upstairs bedroom, where I showed him a series of cards with different shapes. S1 correctly identified 17 of 20 shapes. When I pricked S2's finger with a pin, S1 flinched and identified the exact finger without hesitation. The connection between them appears to be strengthening. Instead of enlisting outside assistance, he started to meticulously record their actions and even created tests to gauge how closely they seemed to be related. As the twins' actions progressed from self-experimentation to involve animals and then humans, this scientific curiosity finally gave way to fear. One entry from 1898 was especially telling. The twins speak now of becoming completely unified. When I asked what they meant, they both finished each other's sentences and explained that they thought their separate bodies were an evolutionary mistake. They were supposed to be one being and wanted to fix this mistake. I find myself increasingly disturbed by such talk, yet cannot help but wonder at the neurological implications. They describe to me a dream they share. Not a dream about each other, but the same dream experienced simultaneously from different perspectives. In this dream, they say they exist as a single consciousness moving freely between two physical forms. I fear this fantasy has become their obsession." Growing concern over his boy's actions was evident in Edward's entries by 1899. He explained how they found animal-based anatomical tests they had done, concentrating on the nervous system. He penned, "Found their latest work in the old root cellar. They have been systematically attempting to create artificial connections between the nervous systems of different animals." The technical skill displayed is beyond what should be possible for boys their age, suggesting they have been conducting these experiments for much longer than I realized. When confronted, they showed no remorse or recognition of wrongdoing. I believe it was Samuel explained that they were simply practicing for what they called the real work. When pressed on what this meant, they responded in unison, making others like us. Until detectives found a small diary concealed in a hidden compartment of her sewing box, Margaret Blackwood's voice was barely heard in the historical record. The diary documented a mother's growing fear of her own children between 1897 and the beginning of 1901. In an entry from December 1897, she wrote, "I no longer sleep soundly. The sound of their whispers reaches me even through closed doors. Edward insists they are simply close, as twins often are, but he does not see what I see when he is working in his study. The way they watch me when they think I'm unaware, the small objects that disappear from my room, the way they sometimes speak to me as if I were not their mother, but a stranger they are studying. I suggested again that we seek help, but E refuses. He is too fascinated by their condition to recognize the danger." A later entry from August 1900 was particularly chilling. "Found them in my room last night, standing on either side of the bed watching me sleep. When I woke and cried out, they did not startle or flee as normal children would. They simply continued to observe me with identical expressions of clinical interest. When I asked what they were doing, they replied in perfect unison that they were memorizing the pattern of my breathing. E dismissed my fears when I told him, suggesting I had been dreaming. I know what I saw. I fear what they are becoming." According to the Blackwood Farms property records, the land was bought by an agricultural cooperative after going unclaimed for almost 10 years following the 1902 fire. The original farmhouse site was apparently off-limits to workers, and it was only used to cultivate crops that needed little human attention. Stories of weird noises and unexplainable occurrences that happened to people who went too near the location of the old home after dark started to circulate around the property. A portion of the earth close to where the farmhouse had stood fell in 1937 after an exceptionally severe downpour, exposing what looked to be an underground room or root cellar that had never been discovered before. During their investigation, county officials discovered nothing except empty shelves and signs of prolonged desertion. Small scratches on the inside walls that looked like early calendars or counting systems were discovered upon closer inspection. Despite persistent local allegations that things had been removed from the site by officials and never made public, the area was filled in and no additional investigation was carried out. Historian James Whitaker interviewed elderly Licking County people who had resided in the region at the time of the Blackwood event in 1963. Although some mentioned those unnatural boys and the notion that they had some kind of unholy connection that permitted them to move between each other, the majority declined to address the issue directly. Walter Jenkins, a young deputy at the time of the investigation, gave Whitaker his memories of the case. One old woman, who would have been a child at the time, recalled that her parents had forbidden her from ever mentioning the Blackwood name or going near their property, stating only that those who died there weren't allowed to rest. In his account, Jenkins mentioned a fact that wasn't mentioned in the official accounts. The way those bodies were arranged in the basement wasn't just random posing. They were positioned in pairs, made to mirror each other exactly, and the twins had done something to the faces, altered them somehow so that each pair looked as similar as possible, like they were trying to create more twins. Sheriff Holcomb ordered us never to speak of it, said it would only plant terrible ideas in the minds of others. One of the first known cases of numerous culprits working together to commit serial murder is the Blackwood case. Although thorough analysis is challenging due to the incomplete records and purposeful suppression of details, criminologists and psychologists are still interested in the psychological aspects of the case, particularly the role of identical twin psychology, isolation, and potential genetic predisposition to psychopathology. According to Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a forensic psychologist who examined the Blackwood case records in 1978, the twins most likely experienced a severe instance of identity fusion, which is frequently observed in some identical twins, along with shared psychosis, folie à deux. She proposed that what started out as a hereditary psychological problem was probably made worse by their remote upbringing and Edward's inadvertent strengthening of their bond through his scientific curiosity. Reynolds stated, "The Blackwood twins represent an extreme case of what happens when a biological predisposition toward identity confusion meets environmental conditions that reinforce rather than remedy the condition. Their apparent obsession with creating unified beings through preservation and modification of victims suggests they were externally manifesting their internal struggle with separate identity. Since Samuel and Silas Blackwood's death certificates have never been found, several scholars have theorized that they may have eventually split up or taken on new identities. A 1965 inquiry by private investigator Harold Murphy, who was looking into past criminal cases for a book he was planning, provides the last plausible explanation for their demise. Murphy found evidence that two males who fit the description of the Blackwood twins might have perished in a 1926 apartment fire in Baltimore. It was said that the victims were discovered in an unusual position, with their hands joined and faces facing one another. There was no indication that either had tried to flee the fire. Nevertheless, Murphy's findings remained uncertain, and positive identification was unattainable. One intriguing detail Murphy found during his investigation was included in his notes, which were later donated to the Crime Museum in Washington, D.C. 6 months prior to the fire. The Baltimore apartment had been rented by a single man who went by the compound name Samuel Silas, which Murphy thought might have been a final fusion of the twins' identities. The cause of the fire was officially listed as accidental, although the fire marshal's report noted that the blaze appeared to have originated simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the apartment. Neighbors reported that they rarely saw the tenant, though several mentioned the odd impression that he occasionally seemed to be different people on different days, though identical in appearance. Conditions that permitted the twins' illness to grow uncontrolled were the Blackwood farm's secluded location, the twins' seclusion from society and schooling, and Edward Blackwood's seeming attempt to control his boy's unsettling conduct without outside help. According to Edward's writings, he was aware of how dangerous his boy's behavior was, but he felt constrained by both his own scientific curiosity into their illness and his fear of being publicly exposed. Edward's final, incomplete essay on the neurological connection between identical twins, a case study, which was discovered concealed in a hollowed-out book in his study, was possibly the most unsettling. It described his observations of his boys over a 16-year period. The last sentence, written approximately 1 week before his anticipated death date, read, "I have come to believe that S and S represent not a deviation from normal twin development, but rather its ultimate expression. The artificial separation of what was once a single fertilized egg creates a divided consciousness that naturally seeks reunification. In most cases, this manifests as the emotional bond commonly observed between twins. In rare instances, however, the division is imperfect, creating a continuous neurological connection that strengthens rather than diminishes with age. The logical conclusion of this process, which I now observe with both scientific fascination and paternal horror, is the complete fusion of two physically separate entities into a single, distributed consciousness. My sons are no longer two individuals, but rather one being experiencing reality through two bodies, and they seek to expand this consciousness further. As we wrap up this explanation of the Blackwood case, it is important to remember that there are still a number of unanswered questions. There is still conjecture regarding the twins' eventual fate, the entire scope of their actions during their years on the run, and the precise nature of their apparent psychic connection. A full historical reconstruction is impossible, since authorities at the time purposefully suppressed case information. Although there are no buildings on the location of the original farmhouse, the farm where these events occurred is still an agricultural area today. In 1975, the County Historical Society rejected a proposed plaque to mark the site's historical significance, preferring to let the memory of the Blackwood incident fade. Locals still view the area with suspicion, and there are still stories of strange occurrences reported by those who venture near the site after dark. Whispers carried on the wind, the sensation of being watched by identical sets of eyes, and the lingering scent of chemicals similar to those once used in early embalming practices. The chairman was said to have stated, "Some aspects of our local history are better left unmentioned. The Blackwood case represents not our heritage, but an aberration best forgotten." The recurrent allegation that surfaced in the 1,970 seconds that the Blackwood twins might have had children during their years of concealment is arguably the most disturbing. Those familiar with the case are still troubled by the idea that their particular psychological and maybe genetic illness may have been handed on to another generation, even if there is no evidence to back this claim. In unpublished notes discovered in the archives of Ohio State University, one researcher wrote, "Some bloodlines are better left to end. Some connections between twins should never have formed. Were Samuel and Silas Blackwood born with their peculiar connection and disturbing proclivities, or were they shaped by isolation and their father's misguided fascination with their condition?" Is the question that haunted Edward Blackwood in his final journal entries, and it still holds true today. The answer is buried with the twins themselves, wherever and whenever their story really ended. A retired officer who had only had a passing connection to the first investigation offered a final, unsettling conclusion to the case in 1969. He asserted that a handwritten manifesto that was allegedly co-written by the twins was one of the artifacts found at the Blackwood farm, but never formally catalogued. It purportedly described a philosophy the twins called unified consciousness, and described their conviction that they were only the initial manifestation of an evolutionary stride that would someday become commonplace. The investigator said the document was burned at Sheriff Holcomb's request. The detective recalled the final line, "We are not two but one, not brothers but a single being, incorrectly divided. What we have learned cannot be unlearned. What we have joined cannot be separated. We will continue until we achieve perfect unity, and then we will help others find the same." The future belongs not to the individual, but to the collective consciousness that spans multiple forms. The Blackwood case serves as a reminder that the most unsettling atrocities can occasionally arise from the most sinister recesses of human psychology and misplaced scientific curiosity rather than from supernatural causes. The line separating scientific research from obsession, between comprehending special circumstances and making them possible, is nevertheless as pertinent now as it was in that isolated Ohio farmhouse more than a century ago.